Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today, in this, the 9th episode of A View from Afar for 2023, political scientist Dr Paul Buchanan and I will examine why there is a trend toward military dictatorship in North Africa. And in particular, Paul and I will analyse the reasons why countries like Sudan, Chad, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso and Guinea have all become part of a challenge to a weakened Western-led global order. And we will examine why this is connected to the authoritarian multipolarity and in this context, a realignment of this order that favours, in some ways, the Russian Federation, Putin's regime. Now, within this context, we will address the complexities of the Russian Federation involvement in the African continent. Involvement that includes the notorious Wagner mercenary group, Russian state-controlled energy giants like Gazprom, that acts in some ways, very clearly actually, as an envoy for the Kremlin, also in diplomatic type of spheres, and how Western powers appear unable to address geopolitical and terrorist-caused instability in the region. Now, today our questions will include: how and why have Africa's dictators found a powerful ally in the Kremlin? We will also ask the questions and analyse who benefits from the Russian North African alliance and what does this association look like? Also, where does all of this leave the fight against terrorist groups such as ISIS in the North African region? And why has Africa become a divide between liberal democracies and authoritarian power blocks in the emerging multipolar global constellation? Okay, so before we cross to Paul, who is waiting online right now, here's an invitation to all of you that are there as our live audience. Now, do feel free to interact with us while we are live. Our preference and our recommendation is YouTube, but if you can get the questions and interaction happening through YouTube, good luck to you there. Through Facebook, good luck to you there. And also remember, if you do make comments or log questions, your interaction may be included in this broadcast. So with all that said and done, let's cross to Paul, who is waiting online to dig down into this absolutely fascinating and revealing big issue. Tēnā koe, Paul. Kia ora e hoa.
Yeah, kia ora, Selwyn. Glad to see you again.
Yeah. So, Paul, this is a big issue that we've been watching for some months now, haven't we? You know, and there's all sorts of interplays with it. Paul, one of the things that stands out to me is that this isn't ad hoc. That this is actually this is by design. In many ways, we can see the timeline. If you do a timeline analysis on different moves, different decisions that are coming out of the Kremlin, we can see North Africa becoming significant. For example, what I'm just talking about there is, you know, leading up even to this week, there's more Western awareness of the pressures that the currency, the ruble, is having in the Russian Federation, tied obviously significantly to its energy exports. If you go back on that timeline analysis, we can see that they have been well ahead of this and realizing that a storm was coming in the currencies, and they've been placing a lot of attention into the African continent, and in particular, the countries that you've identified. Paul, I just wanted to say that, pass it over to you. Once again, the wonderful way that you contextualize all of these complex issues, and then we'll work our way through the program with these basically following the question structures.
Yeah, it's what I was thinking about. Well, this all started our conversations about this actually have a deeper backdrop, but it started because I was concerned, given our conversations, about the rather superficial coverage of the coup in Niger here in New Zealand, but in the Western media. If you notice, except for some serious media outlets, mostly in print, the story is no longer being covered. It certainly isn't here. Here in New Zealand, it's, women's football mania, which I'm pleasantly surprised, but it's obscured more serious issues around the world. But that's against the backdrop of conversations that you have and I have had about three things: about systemic realignment and the long transition in global affairs, about Wagner as a economic, diplomatic, and then military proxy for the Russian Federation that allows, how could I put it, Russia to pursue its interests by other means. In other words, it allows Wagner to go out front. I've seen Western analysis say yes, because that gives them plausible deniability when things get a little, iffy. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. And then you may recall the conversation where I was saying, most of the world is not with the West when it comes to sanctions on Russia for the Ukraine invasion. Most of the world is neutral or sides with Russia, at least de facto. And nowhere is this better seen than in this area of the world. That is Africa in general, but in the Sahel in particular. And so I thought that's what needs to be addressed. We need to look at these things because it's not just about Niger. It's about, there's the 6 countries involved with now our very Russian influence: Sudan on the Red Sea, Chad, I'm going westward, Chad, Niger, Mali, and then to the southwest, Burkina Faso and Guinea on the Atlantic Ocean. All of those places 10 years ago were nominally of the West or neutral. All of them now have significant Russian influence, not just of the Russian state, which has expanded, but most importantly, of Wagner, serving as a proxy. So I thought, let's put these things together and let's talk about the vacuum that was created by the US and French abandonment of the fight against ISIS. Because here's the thing, we'll start with this. Right now, the region that has the most active ISIS/Daesh presence in the world is the Sahel, the countries that I've just mentioned. ISIS fighters are now entering into Guinea and the Gulf of Guinea, the Bay of Guinea. All of the littoral countries are now at risk because they're in Niger and they've never been defeated in Mali. So right now the situation is this with regards to the Western presence, and then we'll get back more seriously into what the Russians are up to. The French have abandoned Mali entirely, and that's where they took the anti-ISIS fight. They took the lead there. They've quit. And in the vacuum left by the French departure, Wagner has introduced itself and has about 2,000 troops. and I'll explain why Wagner is useful to these dictators. And we're going to call it the dictator's belt that
Mm.
stretches from Sudan in the east to Guinea in the west. In Niger, the U.S. has 1,100 troops still there, but they're confined to base. And in this case, there are three bases, two operated by the military and one by the CIA, which run drone operations. So there's a lot of valuable equipment on those bases. And then special forces advisors to the Nigerian troops to fight ISIS in Niger. You may remember in 2017, 4 or 5 U.S. Special Forces troops were killed in Niger in an ambush staged by an ISIS affiliate. And that's really tempered the Pentagon's interest in continuing to fight there. The French have 1,500 people in Niger. They're also confined to base. They're not moving at all. And then the presence of the United States French and the rest of the region is minimal. Token representations, but is not there. Now, many people may say, well, that is good, right? These imperialists always messing with other people. Well, the question you got to ask yourself is that may be true, but is having Wagner there any better?
Yeah,
Now let's get.
you might explain too that clearly, the Kremlin is no friend of the terrorist organizations, and it might be a double-edged kind of maneuver having Wagner there, because one of the primary things that we'll look at a little bit later is protecting Russian interests in the energy relationships it has with the African countries. So I just wanted to add that part in case the audience was thinking we were going down just a particular line where, the problems from these groups like ISIS is multifaceted, isn't it?
Yeah, no. This gets, I mean,
Mm.
like I say, it gets a lot more interesting. But let's deal with the military equation with regards to ISIS, okay? Because that's just
Yeah,
the entree.
yeah. And this
Um,
is the thing where, like in any science, political science, security analysis, that things, if a vacuum forms, something's going to fill it, isn't it? Yeah.
exactly. And right now, ISIS has the advantage in this dictator's belt. Nowhere, although they came close to defeating ISIS in Mali, nowhere has ISIS been defeated, and now they're regrouping in that vacuum that you just mentioned. Now, let's explain the utility of Wagner, right? Because we have to be fair as to why they are so attractive to these dictators. And the reason is really simple. If you look at Western counterinsurgency programs, including that of New Zealand, as it turns out, they're all modeled on the assumption that the best way to fight local insurgencies is hearts and minds. But by that, the weapons side or the military side is that you train local forces to go and take the fight to the insurgents. You don't fight other than in an indirect way, right? You're not leading combat operations. We've seen this with the New Zealand SAS in Afghanistan. We've seen it with New Zealand forces in Iraq. The whole idea, and that's their justification to the home audience is, hey, we're just trainers, right? We're not, we're just training our boys to be professionals just like us.
And we see
Well,
this in the Ukraine conflict with the Western-led countries in their training programs as well, don't we?
right, and I guess the issue is, well, a lot of these Western countries, most of them, in fact, are liberal democracies. So the military brass has to answer to a parliament, as well as the executive. People ask nasty questions about human rights violations, and that's so it gets a little sticky. So the Western model is we train up local counterinsurgency people, and then they deal to the insurgents. Well, they haven't dealt well to ISIS. The record of Western trained forces in Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan is not good. Okay, I'll call it mixed because there have been some minor successes. Now, think of it this way: these guys finally say, in what you might call the Vietnam syndrome, they say, you know what? We've had enough. We're leaving. And so they beat feet out of these places and they leave the local populations at the mercy of the insurgents. And again, the insurgents may have popular support. We're not told that in the West. We're not, who knows if people in Mali actually, support the ISIS campaigns. But what comes to the rescue of the elites in these countries that are confronted by these insurgencies? The Russians. And the Russians come in and they go, look, we're not going to send our own troops. Although, since 2014, Russia has signed military agreements, bilateral military agreements with every single country in the dictator's belt, most involving arms sales and a limited amount of training. But they've got the added option. They say, we're going to send Wagner. And guess what? Wagner doesn't abide by the laws of war. Wagner doesn't give a darn about civilian collateral casualties. Wagner will do combat directly. You guys get out of the way. We don't need to train anybody. We'll get in there. We'll do to these guys. Oh, and by the way, we'll be your personal security force. So you'll get close VIP protection from us rather than, some of the dodgy characters in your presidential guard. And that's a bad reference to the fact that the latest coup in Niger was the president's guard staging a coup against him. So President Bazoum is now living in the basement of his presidential palace, and he's been charged with treason, high treason, by the presidential guard. The penalty for high treason.
He's in there with his wife and one of his sons, isn't
he? Yeah, and but they're going nowhere, and he's been charged with high treason. Penalty for that is death, because he's communicating with members of the Economic Commission for West African States, EWACS for short, and that's considered, treasonous for some reason. We'll get to them in a second. But the point here, Wagner's utility on a military level is their brutality. They're not a state actor, okay? They're not a regular military. They ignore the laws of war. They're not bound by democratic checks and balances. They don't have a pesky parliament to answer to. And so if you're of a dictatorial persuasion and you're confronted by an intractable insurgency that will not go away and is growing now that the West has diminished its presence, then they become very useful.
Now, going through the details of all of that, did you see evidence of perhaps differences in what you would have expected under normal circumstances in conflict relating to collateral damage, casualties, death rates, particularly with civilian sensitivities?
Not really. And I have a suspicion. Again, I guess we should tell our listeners that neither you or I proclaim to be experts on the Sahel or Africa in general. We're looking at a bigger picture thing. So I have read and have been told by people more conversant than I am in African affairs, don't discount the tribal and ethnic and linguistic differences that are simmering under the surface in these coups and whatnot. And so it could well be that a lot of the leaders of the coups see this as a score setting with certain parts of the population that support other factions, within the military and beyond. But what's interesting, and I think what a lot of people may not realize, is that Wagner's upsurge, above and beyond Russia's presence, is intimately tied to the invasion of the Ukraine and Crimea in 2014. They showed that they could take territory. See, Wagner led the charge, especially in the Donbass region, and they were very successful. The Ukrainians were not ready for them at that point. Things have changed since then. But the African countries saw that. They saw how this group came in and took it to the Ukrainians. And they were being talked to by the Russian diplomats who were saying, we could do this for you. You got this restive population out east. We bring these guys in, 2,000 of our guys will match 10,000 of them. easily because we recruit from all over the world. And so 2014 was the moment where Wagner began to grow its presence. And it grew it with the full approval of the Russian state because it was also serving Russian interests. And they've gone on ever since. They've now expanded across that belt. They're in every one of those countries. And here's where I think it gets very interesting because Prigozhin is an evil genius. This is not just about counterinsurgency and close VIP security for political elites. It's about diplomatic representation and, most importantly for Prigozhin, economic exploitation. The Wagner they do a lot of, this is what they do. They say, we will provide you with security. In exchange, you will give us concessions to, for example, gold and diamond mining in your country. Prigozhin operates 400 plus or minus front companies that are involved in logistics, transportation, shipping. He's got his own little merchant navy. This guy's got shell companies all over the place. And so rather taking fees for the security they provide, they take it basically in kind. They say, we'll, let us develop this area that has diamonds or whatever it is. And so they've grown as a multinational to the point, as you and I have talked about off camera, Wagner is becoming the modern version of the East India Trading Company. It has diplomatic representation, it has military representation, but most of all, it has economic interests of its own. It's not just protecting Russian interests, although it does that, but it's got its own now. So they've got a stake, they've got, skin in the game. And as a result, they've become a very effective substitute for Western diplomatic interests, for private multinationals from the West. And there are relatively few of them because what investment from overseas has come in recent decades has come from China. And so they're not really interested in human rights issues anyway. And so it's been truly amazing to see the emergence of this, because what it all comes down to, in my mind, is that bigger systemic realignment and long transition that we've talked about on global affairs. We are now seeing a regional systemic realignment, a regional realignment for short, where the area between Saharan Africa and the savannas of northern sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahel, the semi-arid geographic transition zone, are now moving from a nominally pro-Western orientation up and through the fight against ISIS. Remembering a lot of these countries are former French colonies, to now a very overt pro-Russian orientation that includes, among other things, Mali and Chad voting in favor of Russia when it comes to issues about the Ukraine in the UN, and the other countries abstaining. All right, so the Russians have secured a diplomatic bloc at a strategic level above and beyond the specific interests that they are pursuing. And it appears, well, the Western media appears not to understand this. The Western military, leadership, if you will, understands that, but they're impotent. What are they going to do? Are they going to confront Wagner while the ISIS thing is going on? And they have their own parliaments to answer to. So it's as if the Russians have discovered the Achilles heel of Western security policy is its inability or unwillingness to violate international norms and the laws of war when it comes to dealing with insurgents, political opponents, and the like. They have no compulsion to do anything but wipe them out. And in that measure, they become extremely good allies for the new dictatorial elites in the region.
Mm. So all of this gives the context to the whole thing. Paul, at this juncture, it's probably good that I just kind of give an indication to the audiences about how Russia's energy giants work, not just in representing the energy interests that Russian Federation may have, but act almost, well, in my view, entirely as a diplomatic wing as well. And what that might be of interest to some, but others might think, well, what is the issue there? In a traditional sense, no matter where a country is or how it is configured, whether or not it's liberal democracy or authoritarian, usually there's a diplomatic wing that will engage, or a foreign affairs entity that will be engaging on behalf of the centralised government entity. In this situation with Africa, started picking up in June that things had advanced very, very, very quickly. I'll just bring up on screen for those that are listening a few references here to what we're talking about. Now, here there is a series of statements that we picked up when we were analysing what exactly was happening in that North African region, in particular with energy interests. The African Press Association was putting out statements and information on behalf of the energy chamber, the African energy giants themselves, and what was starting to take a very clear, what was becoming very clear, I should say, was that Gazprom was around the government discussions and very, very engaged there. But beyond that, they weren't just talking about what Gazprom could do for Africa and what Africa could do for Gazprom, so meaning a symbiotic relationship, but they were also pushing they were representing the Kremlin and pushing what the Kremlin was expecting from this and what the Kremlin was prepared to offer in return for basically market access and also a market two-way trade on energy issues. And what's once again is interesting there is that the gas giants, which largely are state-owned, of course, but they were making decisions in the discussions on what the outcomes would be, as opposed to having perhaps their foreign affairs counterpart led by Lavrov and others, of course. So these kind of things were very, very interesting indeed, where you've got a country's energy giants sitting around the government tables making decisions with government representatives in the African continent. So they've just got on up there at the moment, for those that are listening and not watching, the headline is Mozambique and South African Nigerian gas takes centre stage at the African Energy Chamber, and it's coming from their point of view, but it adds Gazprom round table, so it's a two-way thing. It goes into this even more over the days that follow. African Energy Chamber, Gazprom International Round Table explores gas for poverty eradication. And this came out around the time where Russia was signalling that it was going to stop and exit out of the grain deal that it had, basically allowing grain to get out of Ukraine and down to its markets into the rest of the world. And the sensitivities were relating to African and North African poverty that would develop as a consequence from famine and because of the not enough grain getting to them. So dovetailing into this, the Russian Federation was working the diplomatic circle once again with its energy giants, speaking on issues relating to poverty eradication. Bring up another one on the screen here, Paul. The headline once again, that's coming from the African Press Association. That's representing the Energy Chamber as well, the African Energy Chamber in this particular statement. And it's saying Gazprom presents significant developments in Russia's gas motor fuel market during International Gas Roundtable. What that was about was Gazprom was announcing and striking deals on behalf of the Russian Federation government where Africa would be able to export its natural gas reserves as well back to Russia, because Russia was also indicating, well, the Gazprom energy giants were saying, we are have identified and we have an ambitious and industry plan where the future of CNG and LNG as a viable energy efficient alternatives in Russia appears promising. What they're talking about there, and pulling out take the gobbledygook out of it, what they're talking about is an advanced program already where the locomotive industries right around, you can imagine how big this is when you've got a continent the same size that Russian Federation dominates, and they're being fueled by the CNG and also LNG technologies. And it's saying, we want you as a part of that to benefit from this, and we also want a part of what you have for us. So, Paul, I just wanted to show that there's this that is all going on. There's more and more. You can just bring it out, the excitement within the North African fraternity of opportunities, perhaps that with the Russian Federation that they had not believed that they would necessarily have only a matter of months earlier, was starting to really be front-footed. And like we know in government and political circles, that if something starts reaching the public and is being pushed to the public, it is often very much the tip of an iceberg, and that ship is well and truly steaming away toward the goal of which the various parties are wanting to pursue. In amongst all of this, it dovetails into what you were talking about there too, Paul, in many respects. We can see that Gazprom in the Russian Federation territories itself has a private military company presence, which is considerable, as do many of the other state organizations. But in the African context, Wagner appears to be, one, encouraging this type of outcome with respect to mutual, what they see as mutual benefits as far as opening up gas fields and two-way trade on such things. And secondly, protecting Russia's interests to ensure and make sure that the goals that are set by the Kremlin are being met. And this is all the backstory to it. This is also quite different to many in the West, including New Zealand, former SAS soldiers that saw opportunities in private military groups and companies and all over the world. We saw them engage many personnel from their New Zealand trained armies in the specialist areas like SAS, leaving the armed forces, going in and becoming part of commercial interests, protecting the interests of others. We saw it in Iraq in a big way. I know people myself that have worked in that space, up in Papua New Guinea and across to West Papua. The Freeport mine interests are well protected by people who are military trained in the West that have jumped across into private security. So Wagner in that sense is not unique, but the scale of it, and also what is different is that it has government buy-in from the Russian Federation, whereas the laws that outline mercenary type activities in countries like New Zealand and certainly in the West are well and truly in evidence. So I just wanted to give that backstory there to what is going on, and that perhaps is an indicator of where we are and what you're going to be taking us further on from here. Paul, back to you.
Yeah, I think what's very clear is that there are synergies between the Russian state, Russian energy companies, and Wagner. Each protects each other's interests. I would imagine that the energy companies and Wagner have come to an agreement that Wagner can get itself involved in the direct exploitation of mineral resources such as diamonds and gold, but they'll lay off energy exploration where they don't have the expertise, but they can help in providing security to Russian energy interests as they expand throughout this region. Because you're absolutely right. It's not just the Sahel, it's the entirety of Africa. I mean, the Russians are very much involved in Mozambique. They are very much involved in Madagascar. They're very much involved in South Africa. So they're all over the place. It's just here in the Sahel, is where we've seen, I think, I may be wrong, the first regional realignment on broad scale, from a nominally pro-West to a nominally pro-Russian. So the first thing that makes them different from Western private military companies is that synergy. State energy companies and what started out as a PMC, but is now, as I said, evolved into the Russian trading company, whatever you may want to call it. And I think that's significant. I think that may have more long-term effects. The other thing I'll say as an aside, I foolishly didn't write it down to be in front of me. As part of my research into Wagner, I've gone to their recruiting pages, and I urge listeners, again, you do a search and you'll find them. They pay very well. They pay extremely well. But they don't just pay for mercenaries, the killers. They're looking for engineers. They're looking for technicians. Again, they're a full-on multinational company, and again, their pay rates. Let's just say that nothing in Russia, other than what the oligarchs can grab onto, comes close to matching their pay rates. And the number of people who work for Wagner in one capacity or another is, closer to 100,000 people than it is to 10,000, of which a quarter of them, maybe 30% of them, are actual soldiers, security types. The rest are involved in the logistics and direct exploitation of minerals. So, and all of this is done in the face of the powerlessness of the former colonial masters, France and in the Sahel in particular, but also the United States in the wake of the failed war on terrorism. I mean, I wonder what's going to happen to these drone bases and whatnot. The U.S. may have to blow them up as it leaves in order to not have them easily fall into either ISIS or Wagner's hands. That'll be interesting. And then there's the issue. I mean, you and I have harped on this in a nice way about the ineffectual nature of multinational organizations because they have no enforcement capability. They're toothless. Be it the UN in general, be it regional organizations. And in this case, this Economic Commission for West African States, it turns out it's led by Nigeria. They have rotating chairmanships. Nigeria, which sits directly south and shares a border with Niger, they say they're putting together an intervention force, a multinational military force to go into Niger and remove the coup leaders and reinstall President Bazoum, who was democratically elected in 2021. And again, democracy being a very loose concept in that part of the world. Let's not think liberal democracy. Now, what's happened is they gave the coup leaders until August 6th to restore President Bazoum. August 6th came and went. Nothing has happened. Instead, not only did they charge Bazoum with treason, but now there are so-called voluntary defense of Niger groups forming and arming themselves around the country, particularly in border towns where this multinational force may attempt to cross into Niger. And guess what? Who's organizing them? Well, the public faces of local organizers, they say they have no connection to the coup leaders, that they're autonomous. That's why they're called the Voluntary Defenders of Niger. Loose coalition of people who are defending Niger against, foreign intervention. Well, let's just say that behind the African faces, there's these white guys. Okay, there's the organization appears to have a certain influence, a certain flavor, a certain accent to it. So, where I'm going here is that the threat of committing a multinational military force to restore quote unquote democracy in Niger is a bluff. It has no teeth. There's no way that other West African states, Liberia, Nigeria, a whole host of these other countries, are going to invade Niger. They
So
cannot.
just on that, I just make mention here. David Mooring has just joined us late here, and he's put a question in there, joining Wagner. But is it worth your soul? And I don't think David really required a response there, but that's a sentiment that many would kind of look at. But what I jumped in, Paul, just on that point, why I jumped in was the African Union, and in the past has had over decades has had its ability to mobilize a force and create stability. Sierra Leone, for example, I know that when I was reporting going back in Nigeria, the compound where I was located was guarded by a Nigerian soldier who had spent time under the banner of the African Union in Sierra Leone, and he was an interesting chap to talk to for sure. But have you seen any evidence that the other African states are watching carefully at the very least, or more so trying to make sure that there is regional response to regional issues as opposed to external private mercenary type groups like Wagner?
They can't they can't coordinate their response. And let me back up just as an aside to David. Hey, David, is it worth selling your soul to keep on supporting Trump? I'm not saying this to you directly, but think of all those people who support Trump no matter what. I personally think they've sold their souls to the devil. So the Wagnerites, they may be just thrill seekers. In fact, another corollary would be apparently a lot of young Taliban are leaving Afghanistan because they're bored. All they know is conflict and war, and they don't have any skills other than fighting skills. So they're leaving Afghanistan, and they're mostly going in to fight with the Pakistan Taliban. But they're looking for a fight that no longer exists in Afghanistan. So there are many reasons why people may say they sell their souls to Wagner if they have a soul to begin with. But I put them on a scale or a spectrum where Trump is over here, Wagner's over there, and then they can sort of array themselves. Now, the bigger question, here's the trouble with Africa. Africa is rendered, right? We're talking a place, that's way bigger than North America, way bigger than South America. It's a huge place with intense post-colonial divisions and pre-colonial divisions. This is a place that had, hundreds of tribes, ethnicities, religious, including some animist religions. I mean, this is a very, very diverse place. And prior to the colonialists coming in, they didn't always get along. This was not necessarily a peaceful place. Then there's the imposed order of the colonial experience, which for most people in Africa was an unmitigated disaster. It destroyed cultures and that sort of thing. I know that there are white apologists who will say, oh, but the British brought order and administration and whatnot. Well, that may be true. But what is clear is that in the post colonial environment, linguistic differences, ethnic differences, the range of human differences are still there. And that prevents the African Union from organizing as a cohesive force politically, economically, and militarily, except on occasion. It's not like Latin America, where there are two dominant languages, Spanish and Portuguese, which are very similar, and the colonial experience was pretty much uniform across the entire region. That's not the case in Africa. The Portuguese experience is different than the French experience, is different than the German experience, and then there's the bloody British. And so they can't really congeal into a unified mass to deal with political usurpations, such as the one we've just seen in Niger. So, what do? You get sub regional organizations like ECOWAS, sorry, Economic Commission, West African State, yeah, ECOWAS. They have more cultural affinities, political affinities, tribal affinities than the entire continent. And so it's left to them to deal with it. But the weakness of ECOWAS is in its name. It's called the Economic Commission of or Committee of West African States. It's not a military organization. It doesn't have any pre-existing. They say they have an intervention force, and they have the regulations to muster one up. Well, so far, no one's seen any mustering. Again, that's why I say this is a bluff, if not just bluster. And so I don't think we're going to see any sincere effort to forcibly intervene in the Nigerian political equation. And quite frankly, they shouldn't. I mean, I'll be honest with you, Selwyn. If anyone tries to intervene in Niger, particularly African on African, it's going to be a bloodbath. And it'll be a bloodbath for the civilians caught in the middle. The Nigerians have brought in the Wagnerites. I would assume that the Wagnerites are better trained than their Nigerian counterparts. See, Nigeria would have to lead the intervention force, and I don't think they're in the mood for that. So I think the coup leaders have the upper hand because they know they've got absolute backing from the Russians, diplomatically, economically, as well as militarily, with Wagner acting as the surrogate. And so the ball literally is in the Russian, backed dictators' courts. And Wagner has increased its presence over in the Sudan. We've talked a lot about Niger, but they've now established a presence in Chad. They have a mining interest. I was reading that they're now engaged in direct exploitation in southwestern Sudan. So my impression is that Russia and Wagner are here to stay in the Sahel, and we now have the makings of a new status quo. Again, that new regional alignment that the international community is going to have to deal with. And of course, all of this gives Russia leverage in the international community because they now have a diplomatic bloc that will support them irregardless.
You've got where I wanted to go with this, Paul. Exactly right in this space. Just before we do, there's a question with respect to what you're just talking about from David Moring. He says, "Are the Africans supporting Russia the ones with the faded Che Guevara T-shirts?" But I'll let you address that. But also where we are with this, let's take the lens back and look at the big picture. And you just hit on it there in brief, or at the end of what you were just speaking on. Is this what we are seeing? Basically a Russian Federation-led bloc that has the beginnings, in a sense, of that a Cold War type of flavour here. Also from the point of view of liberal democracies versus authoritarianism that we've identified many episodes in the past, but also we touched in the beginnings of this episode. So, Paul, let's take that lens out and look at the big picture. What is going on here strategically? We can see the tactics that are being deployed, and what's the end game here? What can we expect, even in the medium term, in 2024 from all of this?
Well, it's a very good point to bring up Cold War 2.0. And let me tie it into David's comment as well. One of the things I didn't mention at the onset is the sort of strands that we were pulling together to make this show is the fact that Russia was trading on its Cold War credentials to curry favor with a lot of African countries. Just to repeat, Russia supported revolutionary and liberation movements throughout the continent and also in Latin America and also in East Asia. Whereas the Western powers, the colonial powers, supported oppressive dictatorships that kissed their rear ends and allowed them to exploit the countries in question. Right? Now, that historical fact ended with the end of the Cold War. But people's historic memories don't end because a political diplomatic era happened to end. And so the Russians have traded on the very fond memories of now leaders in many countries of their support for revolutionaries, for the people who originally opposed the colonialists. And to David's question, I happen to know a little bit about Che Guevara since I grew up in Argentina and he's Argentine. As David probably doesn't know, but I was the co-team leader of the Cuba Task Force for the Pentagon for a few years. Know a little bit about the Cubans and Che's role with them. Che Guevara fought in Angola for 2 years. He failed. He had to return to Cuba because at that point, I forget what they were. I think of this guy, Jonas Savimbi, who was a Western-backed puppet, but had Western military equipment. Anyway, Che Guevara and some very famous Cuban, later on became generals, were defeated in Angola by a coalition of Western countries, and again, the puppet army that they backed. But that harks to the fact that today in Africa, there are many, many people in leadership positions who think of the Russians fondly. They don't care that Russia is now a capitalist state. It's no longer the Soviet Union. It's no longer socialist. It's none of those things. There's no more Marx and Lenin in Russia than there is here in New Zealand. In fact, I'd say there are more Marxists in Western academia than there are in Moscow. But in Africa, the Russians have cachet. They're considered a friend of Africa against Western imperialism. And so the Russians are trading on this, and they are creating what seems to be the makings of a new Cold War, where a pro-Russian bloc will now confront, I don't think so much their neighbors, although it's possible that could happen, but certainly Western imperialism in the form of particularly US, but other Western military interventions, even if they're against ISIS. See, I get the very strong feeling that although the dictators don't like ISIS, the Russians don't like ISIS, Wagner doesn't like ISIS, they feel that they're better prepared to deal with them as a coalition, as a group, by dealing to them harshly, unencumbered by the strictures of Western international law. And they may well be right along those lines. I think, again, what keeps some of the atrocities in check have nothing to do with ISIS per se. It have all to do with local loyalties and, things that are, if you will, subnational in nature. Again, someone who's of the same tribe or that sort of thing, you'd be less inclined to kill them off.
And
you would warn.
interesting too on that part too, that coming out of the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin, for example, over recent months has been speaking persuasively and seeding out their multipolarity as a means of going forward. Now, you can look at that and be confused by that and be wrong by that by looking at universal multipolar world, if you like. But what we're talking about here is what clearly is in the minds of those that are strategizing from the Kremlin and in Africa too, is that it's a block of multipolarity. It's a multipolar type of interest that may coalesce into one, but is designed in large part to address the geopolitical problems and obviously economic problems through sanction that the Russian Federation has been experiencing, but also the exploitation as the child of colonial Africa. That when I was working, albeit briefly, in Nigeria, it was very clear that who owned the vast energy resources in Nigeria. No one could really tell you because they were lost within the labyrinth of the Cayman Islands, the Isle of Wight, and all of these other places where such interests were hidden. It's a fascinating area. So we can understand, perhaps, by looking at some of these things, and notwithstanding what you were talking about with the ethnicities that came prior to colonialization in the African continent. But we can see that the excesses of exploitation that have occurred in the energy areas, but also in pharma and also in the diamond, et cetera, areas, that all of this leads to, well, when we were children, we're leaders now, but when we were children, the Soviet Union was there to give us a hand. And it seems from what you're talking about that you're not necessarily picking up an ideological connection here, but one of relationship, which is outside of ideological. And that is just the impressions I'm getting from that, Paul, that perhaps if I'm incorrect in some of those assertions, let me know. But that seems to be where you're going with this.
Yeah, there's actually, to my mind, it's more of an overlap. Remember that, for example, we have the same sort of pro-Russian bloc in Latin America. Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and then to a lesser extent, Bolivia. And it's for the same reasons. That is to say, beyond ideological affinity, it was the Russians who supported revolutionary movements. It's part of the reason why Lula is neutral on the Ukraine, because it was Russia that supported the Workers' Party that he's a leader of, but the Communist Party of Brazil, and closer to my upbringing, the Communist Party of Argentina, who were, decimated by the Argentine dictatorships backed by the United States. People don't forget this. Now, I do think that, especially in the case of the Sahel countries, what's going on is that the Russians are trading on this historic solidarity. And, again, they got to do what they got to do. We always say that with regards to China emerging as a great power. Well, the Russians are trading on these historic memories for good reason. It gives them strategic advantages. But what I think they're also saying, this is the economic proposition. They're saying to African states, unlike Western imperialism, which exploited you, extracted, destroyed your cultures, and sent it all back to the West, including stealing your historical artifacts so they can be hung in the British Museum, we will develop you for your own purposes. That our intervention is different. It's foreign, but we're on your side. And it's been interesting because it sparked a bit of a debate. You and I were talking about that William Robinson article, where William Robinson is a very known left academic in the States, written some brilliant books, and he's pointing out, is it necessarily true that South-South imperialism, that is, imperialism led by Russia or China, is necessarily better than Western imperialism? He's arguing there's still capitalist countries in a capitalist world, right? A capitalist system of trade and exchange. And so, what is tangibly different, whether you're exploited by a country of the West or a country of the global South? I think it's a very good point, but I do think there are differences because there are learning curves. Both the Chinese and the Russians have seen the experience of Western imperialists and colonialists. They've seen the resentments that have historically generated as a result of, 500 years of pillage. And so I don't think they're making the same mistakes. Now, the Chinese have a checkered record in Africa for reasons that I don't fully understand, but I think that are more cultural than economic. That the Chinese haven't read Africa, along the lines that we've been talking about, how diverse. One size doesn't fit all. The Russians, on the other hand, I got a feeling that they're going to prove that South imperialism is tangibly better for the recipient country than Western imperialism ever was. That remains to be seen. But if they do promote redistribution and development in the countries in which they're now a dominant foreign force, then the synergies that we mentioned earlier between the Russian state, the energy companies, and Wagner will extend to the governments and hopefully the people of the Sahel. That maybe actually this will be different. I got my doubts. I mean, I'm not a pro-Russian person, but I think we have to take a pause and not just listen to the Western security narrative, although we must be concerned about human rights violations on a mass scale. When Wagner gets involved. But having said that, if the Russian interests are pursued in a way that is more beneficial to Niger, Chad, all these various countries, who am I to say that they're worse or no better than the Western imperialists? Oh, by the way, just geographically speaking, I'm impressed by the size of Africa. Niger is twice the size of the state of Texas in the United States and has 25 million people. We're not talking about, just some sheep herders or something out in the wops. These are millions of people. Mali is, 1.5 times the size of Texas, has 15 million people. These are very big countries. And as a result, they have extreme strategic utility because of what's on them. I mean, minerals in particular, but now the possibility of energy exploitation is real, and the Russians are out in front of everybody. So, whereas the West focuses on security in the Sahel, the Chinese and the Russians focus on development. And if it's fair, who can argue with that? Because after all, as my old counterinsurgency friends used to say all the time, hearts and minds are about putting bread on tables, not about shooting hot lead at a bunch of guys running off in the bush. I think the Chinese and Russians know that better than anyone else.
So let's wrap this up, Paul. How do we pull all of these different elements of today's episodes together to present a picture of where we are now and where we're going to be once again, if we can, in the next 6 months to a year's time? Are we, for example, going to see a 21st century version of what we saw during the Cold War with, Khrushchev thumping the table at the United Nations and things like that? Or is this something a little bit different?
It's different. I mean, I was going to say it's more the same, but not alike. They're, think of it this way. I think we're now about strategic trade-offs. And so if countries in the West were to say to the Russians, we will accept your presence in the Sahel. We will not resist this because you guys are, you can be a benefit, and we've ignored them. After exploiting them, we ignored them until ISIS showed up. But we will do that in exchange for some concessions. One is you've got to negotiate a peace with Ukraine. Just stop with that because that's just going to become a long-term, intractable quagmire, and you can use your resources elsewhere. And the second one, I think, might be don't use the Sahel to stage interventions of your own in other African countries. In other words, don't foment subversion, don't start pushing the envelope and, or pushing for regime change. And of course, the hypocrisy of Western countries telling the Russians and these folks, oh, no regime change in your neighbors. I'm acutely aware of that. But maybe, the acceptance of the new status quo can allow for, I mean, you're absolutely right. The Russians have a different view of this multipolar world. I mean, that was a really good insight yet again. It's not about nation states. I mean, there will be nation states. There will be China. There will be India. There will be the United States. The Russians may think we're no longer able to compete by ourselves, so we'll form a bloc of countries that respond to our diplomatic direction, will get our military protection, but which will economically sustain us in the competition with these other, great powers. I mean, that is, I think that is the constellation that's coming our way. And so, we've got to get out in front of that and say, okay, this is what the world is likely to look like. We got to think of that block. How do we get that block to, come back into the community of nations and agree to a given set of rules? Because I think the international liberal rules, I think they're done with. Some will be retained, others are going to change. And you well know that the Russians and Chinese have said they want no part of the liberal world order. They want a different type of order.
And they're very
And
quick to accentuate the hypocrisies as reasons for that. I think the dangers too can develop out of this, that we see splits not just on liberal democracy and authoritarian grounds, but on this global world order. So in a sense, we could end up in an ideological conflict on the basis of that axis as much as anything else. And that's one of the concerns, I think, that history, particularly, the 1960s and 1970s, shows us the follies of following such traps, if you like. Paul, thank you for that. I'll just bring up a couple of comments that have come in. And once again, David, thank you very much for your contributions
yeah,
here.
thanks, Dave.
David says here, I think the program with modern Russia-led corporate imperialism, so the problem with this, he says, is the amount of gains swallowed up by top oligarchs on both sides. And that is a big issue. That, to me, Paul, is the crux of the whole thing about who benefits. And so thank you, David, for that. And also the last comment David makes here, if Russia gets offside with China, could this raise the possibility of Russia being removed from its permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, as it is not all of the old Soviet Union? So thank you for that. That's another kind of consideration there too. Paul, I'll wrap it up unless there's something else you'd like to add to that.
No, go ahead, just to repeat. Thanks, David, for the good questions. It's always good to have that sort of input. But yeah, I think that those of us who are living far away from the Sahel region and everything need to understand that even though we may live afar, diplomatically and security-wise, we need to take a keener interest. Again, all this started with us being a little bit concerned about the lack of media attention to the bigger stakes other than the coup itself. And I'll leave you with this, just it's tangential to what we've been talking about, but there's another region where countries have been trying to form non-traditional blocs, including both the PRC and Russia, and that region is the Western Pacific. If you think of the influence campaigns, remember, you will remember, Selwyn, the Russian military deal with Fiji?
Yeah.
Under Bainimarama. While Rabuka he's gone cool on that. But the fact is that I think there's the bigger play is that these new emerging ascendant great powers or restored great powers, they're not playing the game the way the West wants them to play. that is, as individual actors, powers. And they're doing this block, construction so that they can create diplomatic coalitions that have weight in international bodies like the UN. And, my fear, since I am liberal democratic in orientation, is that a lot of the Western liberal democracies, which are currently under siege, have their own internal issues, are going to get outplayed in this game of block construction because they're too wedded to the mythical past that benefited them, but which did not necessarily benefit the people of the South. That's where the game's going to be played.
Thank you for that, Paul. That's perfect summary in my view. Okay, people, thank you for your attendance. For those that were with us while we were doing the live recording of this podcast, thank you for your contributions too. And also to those that are going to be listening to the program on demand, and that's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, basically iHeartRadio, wherever you listen to your podcasts, you'll be able to pick this up. And of course on YouTube. Thank you very much for your attendance to our interesting topics. And we will be back in about 2 weeks' time, same place kind of thing, to bring another series of interesting and important issues before the year comes to a conclusion. Until that time, ka kite anō, take care out there, and we'll see you again. May there be a bit more peace to report at some stage too, and that would be a hopeful goal, wouldn't it? Take care.